golden gates of Richard Whitmore's sprawling estate swung silently as his sleek black car rolled in hours earlier than expected. A high-stakes business deal overseas had wrapped sooner than planned, and for the first time in months, Richard looked forward to surprising his family. He imagined walking through the marble foyer to see his wife Cassandra, elegant and poised, and maybe even the new maid Rosa tidying up with her sweet little daughter Amara playing nearby. But as he stepped through the towering front doors, he was greeted not by warmth or laughter, but by the chilling sound of a child's muffled cries echoing from the living room. Richard froze, his pulse quickening, his instincts telling him something was terribly wrong. Moving quietly, he followed the sound, his Italian leather shoes silent on the polished marble. The sight that met him turned his blood cold. His wife, his refined, glamorous Cassandra, stood towering over tiny Amara, Rosa's 6-year-old daughter, her hand clutching the child's arm roughly, while her designer heel lashed out in cruel kicks. "Filthy brat," Cassandra hissed, her eyes sharp with disdain. "Stay away from my things. You don't belong in this house." Amara whimpered, trying to shield herself, tears streaming down her small face. For a moment, Richard couldn't breathe. This was no misunderstanding, no playful discipline. His wife was striking a defenseless child with pure malice. Without thinking, Richard's voice thundered through the room. "Enough." Cassandra froze, her heel hovering mid-air, her face draining of color as she realized they were no longer alone. Richard strode forward, his tall frame casting a shadow that seemed to swallow her whole. "What in God's name are you doing to this child?" he roared, scooping Amara up into his arms. The little girl clung to his shirt, trembling, her sobs muffled against his chest. Cassandra tried to recover, her voice faltering. "Richard, she was in my jewelry box, trying to steal." But Richard cut her off, his tone like steel. "She is a child, Cassandra. A guest under our roof, and you think it's acceptable to lay your hands on her?" His usually calm, businesslike demeanor was gone, replaced by a fury she had never seen before. Cassandra's composure cracked, her face twisting with indignation. "That maid and her brat don't belong here. They're servants, not family. You've let them get too comfortable, Richard. Someone has to remind them of their place." The words slipped from her mouth like venom, and in that instant Richard felt something inside him shatter. For years he had turned a blind eye to Cassandra's arrogance, convincing himself her coldness was merely the cost of marrying into society's upper echelon. But seeing her cruelty now, inflicted upon an innocent child, stripped away every illusion. He saw her not as his wife, but as a stranger, an enemy in his own home. Rosa came running in, her face pale, her apron stained with flour as if she had abandoned her work mid-task. She froze at the sight, her daughter cradled in Richard's arms, Cassandra glaring like a cornered predator. "Señor Whitmore," Rosa gasped, tears spilling instantly. "I'm so sorry. Please forgive her. Amara meant no harm." She dropped to her knees, trembling, expecting anger or dismissal. But Richard turned to her gently, lowering Amara into her mother's embrace. His voice softened only for them. "Rosa, you have nothing to apologize for. The one who should be begging forgiveness stands right there." His eyes burned as they locked on Cassandra, who stood defiant but visibly shaken. What happened next shocked not only Cassandra, but everyone who would later hear the story. Richard marched to the entry hall, yanked the massive bell cord, and summoned the entire household staff. One by one, maids, cooks, gardeners, and butlers appeared, uncertain why their employer was calling them during work hours. When all had gathered, Richard pointed at his wife with a steadiness that silenced the room. "This woman," he declared, "has disgraced my home. She struck a child, the daughter of one of our own. That is not only cruel, it is beneath the dignity of anyone who calls themselves human." Gasps filled the room. Cassandra's face reddened as whispers rippled through the staff, her carefully maintained mask of superiority crumbling before their eyes. Cassandra tried to regain control, her voice rising with desperation. "Richard, how dare you humiliate me in front of the help? You're making a scene over some maid's child? Do you forget who I am? I am your wife, the woman who made you acceptable in society, the reason people respect your name." But Richard raised his hand, silencing her. His voice dropped cold and final. "No, Cassandra. Respect is earned, not bought with jewels and gowns. Tonight you proved yourself unworthy of the name Whitmore. From this moment forward, You are no longer mistress of this house." The staff gasped louder. Rosa covered her mouth in shock, and Amara buried her face against her mother's shoulder. Cassandra's knees nearly buckled as the weight of his words crashed down on her. Richard did not stop there. "Pack your things," he ordered, his voice echoing in the marble hall. "You have 1 hour. And know this, every charity gala, every luncheon, every friend of ours will hear why. You will not leave this house as a victim, Cassandra. You will leave it branded by your cruelty!" Cassandra shrieked, clawing at his arm, but Richard shook her off. The staff, once silent victims of her disdain, stood tall now, emboldened by his words. Some even smirked quietly, the balance of power shifting before their eyes. Rosa wept openly, whispering prayers of gratitude that someone powerful had finally defended her child. By nightfall, Cassandra's suitcases were loaded into a town car, her sobs echoing as she was escorted out. The gates shut behind her with a finality that left no room for return. Inside, Richard gathered the staff once more. "This home will not be ruled by fear or cruelty again," he said firmly. "From today, Rosa and her daughter will not only be safe but cherished. They are family now." The words broke Rosa's composure completely, and she collapsed into tears, clutching Amara as if she could hardly believe it. The staff applauded softly, their loyalty to Richard cemented forever. In the days that followed, word spread like wildfire. Newspapers reported on the scandal, painting Richard as a man of rare integrity among the elite. While Cassandra fled the city in disgrace, Rosa and Amara blossomed in the safety of their new reality. Amara's laughter filled the halls once again, and for the first time in years, Richard felt peace. He had faced the ugliest truth about his marriage and chosen courage over silence. And though society buzzed with gossip, he cared little. For in defending a maid's daughter, Richard had not only saved a child, he had saved his own soul. Cassandra was not the type to surrender quietly, and though the gates had closed behind her that night, her fury only burned hotter. In her mind, Richard's public humiliation was a betrayal she could not forgive. Within a week, the society pages were buzzing again, not with her beauty or elegance, but with her defiance. She had hired a ruthless legal team and was preparing to drag Richard into court. "He replaced me with a maid and her child," she hissed to the reporters who dared to approach her. "I was protecting my home, and now I'm being painted as a monster." But the truth was already leaking. Staff whispered to journalists, neighbors confessed what they had seen, and the image she had spent years curating was dissolving like sugar in rainwater. Richard, meanwhile, remained strangely calm. His advisors begged him to settle privately, to protect his reputation and fortune, but he refused. "If we hide this in shadows, others like her will keep hurting the innocent," he said firmly. He spent his days not in boardrooms but in the garden, walking with little Amara as she slowly recovered from her bruises, her laughter returning in fragments. Rosa hovered near them, torn between gratitude and fear of being the reason her employer's marriage and wealth were under attack. But Richard reassured her time and again. "You are not the cause. Rosa, Cassandra's cruelty is the only crime here." When the trial finally began, it was not the quiet affair Cassandra had hoped for, but a spectacle. The courthouse steps swarmed with cameras, microphones thrust toward Richard and Cassandra alike. Inside, the air was tense, every seat filled with journalists and curious onlookers. Cassandra swept in wearing black silk, a veil of false sorrow covering her face. She whispered to her attorney, rehearsed lies already poised on her tongue. Richard entered moments later, not with a fleet of lawyers, but with Rosa and Amara walking beside him, their presence speaking more loudly than any legal statement could. The crowd gasped at the sight, sympathy surging toward the man who defended a child against his own wife. On the witness stand, Cassandra's words flowed like poison disguised as honey. She painted herself as the victim of a manipulative servant, insisting that Rosa had planted her child near the jewelry box to provoke her. She wept dramatically, clutching a lace handkerchief, claiming she had only pushed Amara away in fear of theft. But when Rosa was called to testify, her trembling voice pierced through the performance. She spoke of years of enduring Cassandra's disdain, of biting her tongue to keep her job, of praying her daughter would not draw Cassandra's attention. Her tears were raw, unpolished, and they struck the jury with the unmistakable ring of truth. Then came the moment no one could forget. Amara herself was asked to speak. The child's tiny voice quivered as she recounted the night, her small hands fidgeting with the edge of her dress. "She kicked me because I touched the box," she whispered, her eyes brimming with tears. "I didn't mean to. I just wanted to see the sparkles. I'm sorry I broke it." The courtroom went utterly silent, reporters frozen mid-scribble, jurors leaning forward as though the words of a child carried more weight than all the arguments before. Richard, seated behind her, felt his throat tighten. He wanted to rush forward, to shield her, but he knew this was her truth to tell. Cassandra's mask cracked under the weight of that innocent testimony. She leapt to her feet, shouting, "She's lying!" "She's exaggerating," but the judge's gavel slammed down, silencing her outburst. The outcry only made her look guilty, and the murmurs in the room swelled like a tide rising against her. For the first time, Cassandra realized that her wealth, her beauty, her carefully crafted reputation were powerless against the pure honesty of a child's trembling confession. Panic flickered across her face as the walls of control she had built began to crumble around her. Richard then took the stand, and instead of launching accusations, he did something no one expected. He spoke not of betrayal or humiliation, but of responsibility. He admitted his own guilt for ignoring Cassandra's cruelty for so long, for choosing silence to protect his social standing, and for failing to act sooner. "I almost lost my soul by pretending not to see," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But that night I chose differently, and I will never again allow wealth or pride to blind me to injustice, especially under my own roof." His words didn't just move the jury, they moved the nation. The verdict came swiftly. The court found Cassandra guilty of child endangerment, her claims of self-defense dismissed as hollow. She was stripped of much of her claim to Richard's fortune, her name permanently stained by the scandal. The once glamorous socialite left the courtroom not to applause or cameras flashing admiration, but to the sound of jeers and the cold click of handcuffs as officers escorted her out. The headlines the next morning read not of Richard's empire, but of his courage. Millionaire chooses justice over silence. Back at the mansion, a new chapter began. The halls once filled with Cassandra's sharp commands now rang with laughter and peace. Rosa continued her work, though Richard insisted she accept lighter duties and better pay, reminding her often, "You're not staff here, you're family." Amara began to heal, not just from her bruises, but from the fear that had once haunted her tiny heart. She skipped through the garden, her joy returning, and in her smile Richard found something priceless: redemption. He knew then that the true legacy he would leave behind was not his wealth, but the courage to defend the innocent. And though Cassandra's shadow lingered in gossip columns and bitter rumors, Richard no longer cared, for he had faced the ugliest truth and chosen compassion over silence, justice over pride. The shock of that night had transformed him forever. Where once he measured his worth in millions, now he measured it in moments. Moments like Amara's laughter, Rosa's gratitude, and the peace that came from knowing he had used his power not to oppress, but to protect. And in that, he found a kind of wealth Cassandra could never touch.